Welcome to the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Sparkling Waters. The photograph on the right was the inspiration for this painting. It's a photograph I took while driving through the White Mountains in New Hampshire. A few of the things that I liked about this subject as it appears in this photograph is the bright light on the right side of the composition and the sparkling in the water. I also like the textures in the trees. This is my sketch. It's a pencil drawing done with a B pencil on a quarter sheet of 140-pound cold pressed Lanaquarel watercolor paper. I've drawn the rock shapes and I've given an indication of where some of the trees are and some of the tree lines. And some of the trees I just indicate with a vertical line. I don't try and render all the features on the rocks and little water and all that. You'll see why as I develop my painting. I do most of that as I paint. I don't draw a lot of that out in advance. I'm just more concerned with the major shapes and some things that show direction, and I'll put in a little bit of detail where I feel it's needed. When I'm working with a subject like this, I like to work with masking fluid to preserve some of the highlights, create some of the sparkle in the water, and the textures in the trees. And to do this, I'll begin applying masking fluid using a fine line masking fluid bottle, which is a bottle that I filled myself. And I'm making some horizontal marks now in the area that's the water that will capture the feeling of the sparkle later on in my painting process as I remove this. As I make these marks, they're not just straight lines, they're not solid, they're broken up, they're dashes, they're dots, they're odd little shapes. They go in different directions at times to suggest the various flow patterns in the river. The particular masking fluid I'm using dries clear, and you can find all the masking supplies that I use on the studio page of my website, surowicz.com. But I like to use the clear or the white mask because it doesn't leave any stain. And I fill these little bottles myself as an economical alternative to the prepackaged fine line tip marking pens or masking pens. So here I'm continuing to apply the masking fluid to give the suggestion of the ripples in the water, the sparkling in the water, and I'm bringing those masked areas right up to the edge of some of these stones that are the large rocks that are in the river. And as I start to come forward more towards the foreground, I'll start to shift these from being as horizontal to a little bit more directional, because as I'm getting into the foreground, I can start to see more of the direction of the flow. When it's in the distance, it's just kind of the horizontal planes that you tend to see. This does take some patience, and at times these fine line masking pens do clog, but I feel they're worth the effort. It's a lot easier than trying to use a brush or a ruling pen or something like that you have to keep reloading. And I rarely use a brush to apply masking fluid. There's a couple different ways I use it, but I have a fine tip bottle, I have a broader tip bottle. I'll splatter it with a toothbrush, and I'll push it around some with a rubber tip shaping tool after I put down a bead of it. But I find that's a good technique for creating some of these textures and these highlights that are hard to get by just trying to paint around. It's very hard to paint around some of these narrow little shapes, and especially when you start using it to make represent branches and things like that. It's very small, very difficult to paint around those, and this is a good technique if you're going to work transparently and not use any opaque paint such as I do. That's the way I choose to work. Here I'm continuing to work in the water, and something to keep in mind is even though some of these marks just seem arbitrary, there is an intentional direction and length and shape that I'm trying to get, and you have to think of this as painting almost in reverse. You're masking it, but these marks in the end are going to show just as if you'd made a brush stroke. So just because you're putting down masking fluid and creating textures, don't be so haphazard that the mark you make doesn't represent the subject that you're trying to suggest there or trying to protect. Again, think of it as if if you were making that mark with a paintbrush, how would you do it? And you should really approach it the same as you're using this masking fluid. Now, some of it is splattering and things like that is a little different, but in particular when you're trying to suggest branches and things like that, make sure you take them to the edge of a rock or a tree or a shoreline, and don't just let it stop and float in the middle if that's not what the subject is telling you it's doing. Here I'm using the masking fluid and applying a bead along the edge of some of these rocks so I can preserve a nice brightly lit edge. To me, this is another good application of this technique. You can paint around this if you choose to also. Sometimes though you lose track of it and you might paint over something that you otherwise wanted to keep the white of the paper. So when I'm masking like this, sometimes I go ahead and I'll put a bead or highlight on something such as this rock or a tree or the edge of a shore. If you do pause when using this type of an applicator, make sure you put your cap on it because it will tend to dry up quickly and it can be difficult to clean the steel tip on these. The second technique I'm going to use to apply masking fluid is using a toothbrush dipped in a jar of masking fluid. And before I do this, I put some soapy water in the toothbrush. It makes it easier to clean, but these are inexpensive toothbrushes, and in time you just need to replace it with a new one. So normally I'll splatter it with my finger, pulling back the bristles and letting it splatter the paint. And the other thing I'll do is I'll tap the toothbrush or my hand against my wrist, and it'll splatter that way. And the second technique there, hitting it on the wrist, tends to leave larger drops. When I'm using my finger like that, they're smaller drops. So as I hit that and tap that, those tend to be larger droplets of the masking fluid that fall. So here what I'm trying to do is create textures in these tree shapes that I have here. And what I'll do is I'll put some darker valued washes down and later on remove this masking fluid, and it'll reveal some white areas, and I'll glaze over those with a variety of yellows and greens and sometimes blue to represent sky in the trees. But because I'm preserving it now, it gives me the opportunity to have this interesting texture later. And again, you can't paint around little droplets to create the same effect as you would getting the splatter. That's why I like this technique. And I'll also splatter a little bit around the water and the rocks, and that just gives a suggestion, I feel, of splashing and sparkling in the water. Before I begin to paint, I'll go through the colors that I use in this painting. Sap green, royal blue, and you could also use indanthrone blue, indanthrene blue, or delft blue. I use cerulean blue, and I like to mix that with raw sienna, and I use a PB36 formulation. Sometimes the PB35 formulation tends to make a green color with those two combinations, so I prefer the PB36. I also use cobalt blue, quinacridone rose madder, alizarin crimson quinacridone, quinacridone coral, pyrrole red, quinacridone gold, raw sienna, and cadmium yellow light. I'm going to begin my painting with a sky wash, and for this wash I'm just using cerulean blue. If you take a quick look at my palette, you'll see that I'm just taking some cerulean blue and water, and I'm making a nice big puddle on the palette. So to paint the sky, I'm putting these brush strokes of the cerulean blue on my paper, just kind of arbitrarily. And my photo has kind of a bland blue sky in it, so I'm just going to kind of create just a partly cloudy day. It's just kind of a blue sky with a little bit of fluffy clouds in it. So I'm being very liberal, putting some of the cerulean blue down. And now I'm going to soften that up using a fine mist spray bottle. And I'll take a tissue and I'll blot this a little bit. So I'm working at a 15 to 20 degree angle, so you can see the water wants to flow down the page. So I'm going to use my tissue to capture some of that and blot it up. But I use this spray to help soften edges and kind of create that partly cloudy sky. So as I do this, I'll dry it here when I'm happy with what I have on the paper here. And sometimes it might dry a little lighter than what I'm after, or I might not quite like the shape that results in the end. So I might come back and add to it after I've dried it for the first time. I might come back a second or even a third time just to put a few touches in there and get the feeling that I'm after and the kind of the shapes in the sky that I'm after. So here I've dried it, and it is a little light in some areas, and I'm not quite happy with some of the shapes, so I'm just going to put a few more touches of color in there and come back with my spray bottle and add to what I've already put down on my paper. Another way to do this would be working wet and wet, but I like to work wet on dry and then come in with a fine mist spray. I feel I have better control on where the paint's going to flow, and I like to use that spray also sometimes to help create some direction with my paint application. The next area I'm going to work in is in the water. In some areas I'm going to paint some of the blue areas in the water. There's a large kind of shape that's defined on where the majority of the blues appear, and I'm going to paint that. And I'm going to show you here, I'm using some cobalt blue and some quinacridone and rose madder, just a touch of that, and I'm making almost a violet. It's kind of a blue violet. Try not to get it too red, and I'll add a little bit more cobalt blue on an area in the palette. I like to, when I'm going in specific areas and working with kind of what I refer to as a different color set, I'll clean my palette and then I'll kind of set it up so that I have the colors that I want to work in the areas I'll be working before I begin to paint. I don't just do it randomly as I go. Sometimes I do, but in general I kind of set my palette up to go after the area that I plan on working, and then I'll clean my palette. I frequently clean my palette. I know some people choose just to leave it dirty, and that's fine. You just have to take the approach that works best for you. So now I'm going to take some of that mixture and I'm going to paint some of the areas that are the larger blue shapes in the water. If you look at this photo, you'll see it's very, very bright white to the right, and kind of in the center there's quite a bit of blue tones. And as you get farther to the left, it's picking up some of the earth tones from the trees and the rocks that are on the shoreline. So now I'm just almost making a placeholder for those blue tones. And I'm varying the mixture. I'm using some of the purple tone. I'll come back with some more of the cobalt blue also. And I didn't show on my palette but in the mixing, but I'll also bring in a little bit of cerulean blue, which I added to my palette, which picks up some of that sky color. So it's not a dark value, but I'm going to blot this a little bit because I don't want this initial wash of blue that I'm putting down to be very dark, because I'm going to do some brush work on top of this. And keep in mind that this is an area that has quite a bit of masking to preserve some of that sparkling in the water and some of those white linear shapes and that kind of represent the flow of the water. So those will come, you'll see those later once we lift the masking fluid. I'm going to soften this up a little bit and lighten it up in areas and give it a little bit more of a watery feel by using a fine mist spray bottle. So I'm going to take that spray and just make some directional flows of paint in my wash and just soften that up a little bit. And I'll be doing quite a bit of work on top of this later on. I'm going to begin to paint some of the tree areas, and before I do, I'm going to show you the setup of my palette. So I'm taking sap green, I'm putting some on both sides of my palette. I tend to keep cool colors on the right side of my palette, warm colors on the left. Some are out of place, but that's the general layout. And so this is some quinacridone gold, and this is cad yellow light. I try to mix them that way too, cool colors on one side, warm on the others. However, sometimes I need to put one or the other on the other side. So there I have some quinacridone gold and some quinacridone coral. Gives me a nice red tone and a kind of almost a bright burnt sienna tone. Here I mix in some of the sap green with the cad yellow light to give me a very light green. And here I'm taking some of that green and adding it to the quinacridone gold. You can see that I'm setting my palette up with a variety of mixtures here. And I'll grab these as I need them as I progress with the painting process. So on this side I'm going to take some sap green and I'm going to add a little bit of pyro red to this mixture. We'll neutralize it a little bit. It'll lean towards warm, but I'll tend to still keep this mixture because of space limitations on the right side of my palette. But I'm going to take some pyro red here, and I'm going to add it to that sap green, and that gives me a green that's more of an earthy tone than just a sap green. So now I've added that to the variety that I have to work with. Some more sap green, a little more pyro red. Trying to make a bit of a darker mixture. And I'm going to take some royal blue, and I'm going to try and make a cooler green here. So sometimes with this sap green, royal blue, and pyro red mixtures, you can get a gray tone, almost a neutral gray, kind of a charcoal gray. If that's not what you're after, you just need to shift the ratio of these colors, and you can warm it back up or cool it down or make it greener. So as you look at my palette here, you can see that I have a wide assortment of colors to choose from here as I paint these trees. I have some bright greens, some earthy greens. I have cool and warmer greens. I have some orange and red tones and some gold tones. So just a nice assortment to work with. And when I'm done and I'm ready to work in another area using different colors, again, I'll clean my palette and set up another color set to work with for the area that I'm going to be working in. Here I've already started to paint some trees, and I started with a dark valued cool mixture here. And now I've come in with a little bit of a dark yellow green, and I'm going to put some red tones in there. You'll notice as I paint these that I frequently change the mixtures that I'm using. I'll go from the more yellow green to the blue green into just an earthy green and more neutral green. And I'll just mix this up. Here I'm using a wash brush. This is a Silver Black Velvet Jumbo Round Small. And I'm being very liberal and loose with the brush strokes. You know, at this point, I'm not trying to paint individual trees. I'm viewing this tree line as one big shape. However, at the top, you start to have the features of individual trees as they come over the mass of trees that form up that whole tree line. And this is something that I'll do. I'll be working in these areas many times. This area will be dry, and I'll come back a number of times and put some different layers and some different features on here. Sometimes it'll be trunks or branches. Other times it'll just be dark areas that represent shadowed areas or cool greens or warm greens. But I'll come over these areas a number of times until I have the result that I'm after. And you can see here I'm switching up from a kind of a gold sap green mixture to to the red mixture. And what I'm painting right now is there's some trees here that the trunks are backlit. So I'm painting this area a little lighter. I'm going to let it dry, and then I'll come back over and I'll paint the silhouette of some of those darker tree trunks over top of that. And now I'm moving to the left side here, just using big brush strokes, painting this large shape, and I'm going to be changing up the mixture I'll be using here. And initially, I really view this as one big shape, and then as I move through my painting process, I'll start to get a little bit more specific with my brush marks and values, and start to be a little more particular in defining some individual shapes. But this initial step, I'm just trying to get some nice variation of green colors down in this large shape. And remember, there's a lot of masking fluid splattered in this area, so there's going to be a lot of texture when I come back. So I want to make sure that this initial wash has some dark enough values that those areas with a splatter that of the masking fluid will stand out when I remove the mask. So far I've put down some of the brighter greens with some of the red tones, and now I'm coming with a dark, cool green in this area that's closer to the foreground. And just painting this as big as a big shape. And again, in this initial stage, I'm not trying to get real detailed. I'm just trying to block out some of these large shapes and get the general colors that I'm going to have in that area. But I do think in layers, and I keep thinking about what has to go down first as I build values and shapes over top. So my darker values are obviously going to be going last, because some of those go over top of some of these other lighter shapes, and there's a lot of overlap that happens. And I still want to capture the character of some of these edges. So even though I've just put this in and kind of blocked it in loosely, I'm going to start to work with a brush here that still a little too wet, but I take some of the moisture off this brush on my cloth, and I'm just dragging the side of it to give some a variety of edge here, not just a straight line, and make it feel more like the leaves on the trees. Here I'm going to come back to the area where I painted a light shape of kind of yellow-green tones, and I'm painting these tree trunks that are backlit by those light colors there. So this is a good example of where it helps to really plan your painting and how you're going to approach it, and take a look at it and make decisions on what should go down first. In this one, it would be very tough to come in and put the sky in as I did after I've done some of these other things. I wouldn't want to put a big sky wash after I put down some of my trees and things, and I'd start to get a lot of running of colors. But this is an area where there's a light shape behind these dark linear shapes formed by the tree trunks, and it just makes sense to put that light layer down and then come over top with the darker shapes. As I paint this, you can see why there's no value in me doing a detailed rendering for a pencil sketch. As I had mentioned earlier, a lot of this develops as I paint. I'm putting in these large block shapes of paint. And if I had drawn a bunch of individual trees and little branches and every little stick that's in my photograph, I couldn't take this approach. Everything would be covered up, and I would be working with a little brush instead. But that's just not how I like to paint these subjects. I like to just work with a looser approach, and I put a lot of focus on the layers that I build. But I like to do a lot of the development of the painting with my brush and in the painting process, rather than with an initial sketch. I don't want to put down almost a paint by number drawing to fill in with watercolor. I like to be expressive with my paints and my brush. But I always tell people you should paint the way that you prefer to paint and enjoy to paint. That makes us individuals. So some people like to start in one corner of their paper, and when they get to the other edge of the paper, they're done with their painting. There's nothing wrong with that if that's the way you enjoy painting. So it's all about personal preference. Here again, I want those edges to look a little bit more like the leaves of trees and not like hard edges of rocks. So I'm just taking the side of my brush and dragging it across the paper, and I already have a little added texture because of the splattering that I did with the masking fluid. And I'm going to take a darker, cooler wash and put it over top of some of those the area that I've already painted. And here I'm starting to develop some areas that are more recessed or in shadow, even though I'm still not being real precise with my brush stroke. But there's some areas when I want to darken the values a little bit. Now I'm going to bring a darker, cooler value to the left side here. And these areas, the one on the right, one on the left, one of the things they have kind of in common, those dark areas that I've painted, is they're about the same place in the middle ground. So as you go back in spatially, as you go from the foreground to the middle ground to the background, these values are happening in kind of in the middle ground there on these tree shapes, and they're the ones that are closest to us. Now I'm going to take a rigger brush, and this has a mixture of raw umber with some royal blue, and at times I'll warm it up a little bit with a little alizarin crimson to give it a red tone, but it's very dark value. Now I'm giving the indication of a tree. One of the things as I paint this tree shape to think about is as I've painted all these different colors in the trees, there's the red tones, the gold tones, the kind of yellow green tones. I've picked colors from the variety of mixtures I had on my palette, and I've tried to give all the colors I'm using. I show mixtures on my palette, but practice. The best way to learn is to experiment with those colors for yourself, and try and mix a yellow green or a middle value earthy green using some of those colors. I know a lot of times people want to know what colors are on the brush with every brush stroke, and it's hard to do that. It's not practical, but I try to give just information from time to time on what I'm using in a particular area. But just think about the palette that I had laid out with all those green tones, and just experiment. When you want something that's a gold tone, use a gold mixture, or a yellow green, or a cool green, using some of the blue tones in it. But that's the best way to learn, is to experiment. It's kind of, you get a start with some of what I show, but it's hard to tell with every brush stroke exactly what colors are on there, and people need to start to get a feel for that themselves. So I try to give you some of the information, but challenge yourself to create some of these mixtures, and you'll find that you'll make a lot of progress in doing so. So now I've painted a few of these tall tree trunks, one to the left, one to the right, and now I'm going to make an indication in some other areas of some tree trunks and some linear marks, and some of the trees I've already done, and then just some trunks that are just in other areas, just beside these, just some verticality in the composition. And then I'm going to come in with some branches too in some different places, and because of the layers that I've built up, as I make some of these brush strokes, you'll see them and then they'll disappear and they'll reappear because of the dark and light values that I'm going over top of. So I can make some of these linear marks to represent branches or trunks, and they'll appear and disappear and reappear because in some areas they're going over light value, in some areas they're going over dark value. So it helps break it up and creates interest. And also, creating this overlap helps build depth into the painting. Every time you can create overlap, to me, you start to build depth into your composition. Here I'm going to do some more work on this tall tree to the right. And I'm just trying to capture the feeling of the way these branches hang off this very kind of tall, slender tree. And then I'll come in with a variety of colors and values from the palette that I set up with all the green, gold, and blue tones that I had on my the palette that I set up for painting all the trees here. I'm using a quill brush at the moment. It has a nice sharp tip on it and holds a lot of paint, so you can see I can go pretty far with it without having to reload my brush. Oftentimes after I make a brush mark, I may touch it with a tissue or my finger or something just to create an interesting texture in the little area that I just applied the paint. Here I'm doing similar brush work on this tree to the left. And you'll see I'm using this quill brush. It has a nice fine point, but there's times when I put it on its side and I'll drag it. A lot of times people don't get as much out of a brush as you can. You can use all areas of a brush, every edge, the tip. You can pull it in different directions. You can load it with different moisture contents. There's so many different things you can do with a brush. Sometimes we limit it and we want to paint like we're painting a wall with a brush all the time. But you can see I pull, I push, I drag, I slide the brush to give me a variety of textures in this application here where I'm painting this tree. I'm going to move on and start painting some rocks, but before I do, I wanted to show you my palette. This is the palette that I set up before I started painting the trees, and this is after I've done a lot of work in all those trees. You can see how I've moved paint around and mixed things together, but I just have quite a variety here, and this is where you start to learn how to experiment to get the colors that you want just by mixing. You can see I have nice big pools of color. And then now that I'm ready to move on, I'm going to clean this. I'm going to start with a new setup. Here I'm going to show you the palette that I'm going to set up to paint the rocks in my composition. So here I have raw sienna. I'm going to take some cerulean blue, and as I mentioned when I was going through the colors, I use a PB36 pigment in my cerulean blue. Some of the PB35 formulations tend to get a green mixture when you mix them together like I am right here. But I don't have a lot of trouble with what I'm using, so I kind of like the results I get. So I've got a warm and cool using raw sienna and cerulean blue. Now I'm taking some raw umber, and I'm going to take some alizarin crimson, and I'm going to get a kind of a reddish brown, a deep red brown. And I'm going to take some royal blue. I'm going to mix it with the raw sienna, and that's going to give me a cooler mixture. I'm adding some alizarin crimson to it also, which kind of makes it purple, and then that raw umber takes it down a little bit, so it's not such a purpley violet tone. But once again, just as I did with the greens, as I was getting ready to paint the trees, I'm getting ready to paint these rocks, and I'm setting up myself up with a variety of mixtures to work with. Here I'm going to add some quinacridone gold that I'll use also on some of these rocks. By setting my palette up in this manner, it's very easy to put down some washes that have quite a variety of colors in it. Now I'm going to start to paint the rocks with a palette that I set up. And you can see here I'm putting a gold tone down, and now I'm going to get a richer brown tone. This is a mixture of the raw umber with some alizarin crimson in it. So it's a warm brown tone. Now I've got some of the cooler mixture with royal blue and raw umber. So I'll alternate as I paint these rock shapes with warm and cool colors. And I'll vary the values somewhat, but a lot of these are going to be fairly dark shaded rock shapes in the end, just because of the way the composition is and the way the light is. And I'm painting these just with big brush strokes. I'm not using a real large brush, but I'm not being nitpicky and trying to paint little grooves in these rocks. I'm just kind of looking at them as big shapes and thinking about shapes and value. And keep in mind, this is another area where I have some masking, so some of these edges have a highlight masked on them, which will show later in my painting process. So I'll just go from rock to rock, and I'll skip as I go often, because when edges are touching, I don't want it to bleed from one end to the other. So it depends on the placement, or if there's a highlight or something, I may not do a rock that's right beside one I just painted until I dry it. Most of these rocks have a shadowed side with a highlight edge on the top or on the side, depending on the placement of the particular rock. But in general, they're predominantly very dark shapes, and it's hard to pick up somewhat in the camera. But some of these are warm darks, and some of these are cool darks. So the warmer darks are a mixture of raw umber with alizarin crimson, and the cooler darks tend to be a mixture of royal blue with raw umber, and I might have a little bit of alizarin crimson in there at times to give me a purple tone too. One of the challenges with doing a YouTube video is trying to keep the video itself to a reasonable length. It gets too long, it gets hard to watch, and but some subjects are more complex than others and are hard to consolidate. Ideally, I like to do videos that I can consolidate down to about a 30 or 40 minute video. However, this one's a bit more complex and it's going to be a long video, but I think it's an interesting subject and worth doing. But again, it's difficult to do these as one video because it does get pretty long, so I try to consolidate some of the repetition where I can. And here you can see I'm progressing through the various rock shapes here, and I'm just working with the same mixtures that I have set up on my palette. And I often, in this situation, I'll start with the warm tone, since it's closer to the highlighted edge of the rock, and then I'll bring in a darker value tone as I come down to the shadowed side of the rock. So here I'm continuing that darker value and a cooler value along the edge of this very long, slender rock. And here again you see I'm beginning with some of the warm tones, and I'll use some of the cooler tones. And it's very easy for me to do that because I have the variety of mixtures already on my palette. If I was trying to squeeze this out of my tube and mix this as I was painting, it'd be very difficult to do. And I like to have big mixing areas. I don't like to work in little wells the size of a dime or a quarter. I like to work in a couple big mixing areas in the center of my palette. And I like to set it up, as I showed you, with a variety of colors available to me. I want the value on the side of some of these rocks to be darker than what I have. So I'm going back over top of them with a darker mixture. Again, still using the same colors I had set up on my palette. I'm just taking one of the dark mixtures that I had there. I'm using a variety of mixtures that I have. I'm using the warm and the cool. but you can see that just darkening these shapes up a little bit. I want these rocks that are nearer to the foreground to be darker value than some of those in the distance. Now I'm going to paint this larger rock shape that's more in the foreground here. And I'm using a 1/2 inch flat brush. I'm using the same pool of colors that I set up on my palette. And here I've got quite a bit of water. That's almost a light purple tone that I just put down there. But you can see some of the warm raw sienna mixture, a little touch of quinacridone gold. There's still a lot of water in that brush. If when you paint, your brush constantly leaves dry marks, you're not putting enough moisture in your brush and not loading it up enough. When you're painting big washes like this, it should cover the page with the paper with every stroke. It shouldn't look like a bunch of dry brush. So get in the habit of really loading your brush up when you're working like this. And this is a good illustration here of the variety of warm and cool. You can see those kind of raw sienna and gold tones that I have, and then they transition down into some of the darker tones, but it's all one big wash, and I'm just loading my brush up with a different mixture when I'm going to my palette. And now I'm painting this rock shape behind the one in the foreground there, and I'm using the dark mixture of raw umber with some alizarin crimson in it. The one that's closer to us has more purple in it and some blue. And you know, when you paint things like this, you try and use your imagination a little bit more when you're thinking about some of the colors. Rocks aren't just pulling out a tube of burnt sienna and raw umber and painting everything brown. There's lots of colors that happen in some of these rocks. And if you really look close, there's lots of blues and violets and gold tones and red tones in some of the rocks. They're not just a bunch of brown shapes. Now I'm going to begin to paint the water again. And if you look at the reference photo in the top right corner, you can see on that left side, it's not reflecting the color of the sky. It's not picking up blue tones. It's picking up the colors that are in the trees and in the rocks. So I've got a mixture here of quinacridone gold with some raw umber and some raw sienna, and I'm going to just put down a wash. It's darker value than the blue wash I put down earlier, but you can see in the photo how that is a darker value to the left than those blue tones in the right overall, even though there are some dark values of blue that'll be in the painting. So this is a big wash, and I'm changing what I'm loading into my brush. I've gone from gold to a mixture of raw umber and alizarin crimson to a mixture that has some raw umber and some royal blue in it with a little bit of alizarin crimson. It gives almost a purple tone, a very dark purple tone. But I'm just mixing these colors as I put them down on paper. I'm letting those colors mingle together in one large wash. And keep in mind, working at an angle helps those paints kind of merge together, because the gravity starts to pull that paint down, and it'll pull one color into the other, or one value into the other, depending on the actual mixture. Now the mixture I'm going to start to use has a little bit more green in it, and I'm painting these areas that I'm painting right now with the intent of giving the suggestion more of some ripples in the water and the current of the river. So it's less of a one big shape and a collection of smaller shapes that in the end almost make a big shape, but it's broken up into smaller elements. So I'm trying to be purposeful with the direction and motion I'm making with my brush as I put these brush strokes down. I want each brush stroke to give the suggestion of direction of the water, or an area where it's coming across an obstacle and changing direction. But I do that with the brush strokes that I'm putting down. You can see that I've put down a number of these smaller shapes, and it's going up the left side of the composition area of the water along the shoreline. And as I move back in space, these brush marks do more to define some of the turbulence and some of the ripples in the water, and not so much the direction of current, such as in the foreground. In the foreground, you can see the current and the direction are kind of curvy, and they curve around and go almost vertical. But as I go back and further in the water, it's picking up more some of the ripples and the unevenness of the water, and it becomes much more horizontal with the brush strokes that I'm making. Now here I'm back in the foreground and just making some more marks, and I'm going to take this dark value and just even though it's broken up, it's going to indicate the reflection of this rock. It's in a spot from the vantage point that the viewer is at, that you would be able to see some of the reflection of this rock, but it's going to be broken up by the current and the ripples in the water. So as I paint this, it's going to be broken up into smaller shapes. So the current is interrupting the reflection of that image. Now on the right side here, this area is the area with a lot of bright white paper is going to show through. So I have a fine brush here, and I'm just making some smaller indications of the ripples, but it's not going to be anywhere near the volume of the darker values that I have on the left side of my composition. There is some gold tone being reflected down into the water on the right side here, and I'm going to take some of the quinacridone gold to paint that area of water that's showing in between the rocks there, and it's reflecting some of the gold tones off the trees. Next, I'm going to come in with some stronger colors of blue into the water. So I'm using cerulean blue, and there's some times where I'll mix in a little bit of cobalt blue with some quinacridone rose madder in it. But this is going to favor more the left side of the composition than the right, because I'm going to have this stronger blue tone that comes alongside the earthy tones on the left, where it's reflecting the greens and the browns, and it comes right up alongside of that and goes towards the middle of the composition. But as I start to get farther to the right, there's less color because it's in bright light, so I want to keep a lot of the white of the paper showing through there. So some of these brush strokes follow the marks that I made previous, again, to try and enhance the suggestion of the flow of the current, especially here in the foreground. But some of the brush strokes are just going to be horizontal and just indicate more the ripples of the water. But this is more actually a larger shape, less some of the little linear marks that I'm made to show current and ripples of the water. Overall, this blue that I'm putting down is really a one big large shape, but I'm still working in some of these accents they're smaller marks to help define current. Now I'm taking some of that blue tone over to the right, but it's broken up much more, and there's not going to be near as much of it. And again, I want to take that to the edge of the rock in some places, just to show that it's going behind it. Now I'm going to take a darker mixture here, and I'm going to strengthen the reflection by some of these rocks. So just a few brush strokes in some cases, just to indicate a little bit of the reflection of the rocks. Here I'm using a violet tone to strengthen the value in some of the blue areas. So it's a blue violet, just to give some darker values in some of the blue areas of the water. As your painting develops and you move through your painting process, you constantly have to reevaluate areas that you've painted as they relate to the changes that you're making as you progress. And areas that seem dark enough initially, you may want to go back and make darker. That's one thing that I constantly find myself doing. As a painting evolves, I'll decide that what I thought was an okay value isn't quite dark enough, and I'll go back and I'll darken that. And that's what I'm doing here on some of these rocks. I feel there need to be darker values. Some of these are more in shadow, and they're more in the foreground. That's where I'm putting some of the strongest values here. So it's a constant process of evaluating and reevaluating and look at them in the context of the evolution of your painting. And I've decided this rock here in the very front of the foreground here, the closest rock to me, needs to be a much darker value. So I'm taking some of my dark values mixture using the royal blue and the alizarin crimson and the raw umber, and I'm painting this a very dark value. And here you can see just how dark I've made that rock there that's the closest to us. It's the darkest valued shape that I have in my composition. And I want to carry that darker value to the next rock that's right behind it. So I'm going to take a mixture here. This is a little bit warmer mixture. This is the raw umber with some alizarin crimson in it. This also creates an area of the strongest area of contrast, because this is where I have those bright white of the paper, and I've positioned some of the darkest valued shapes that I have in my composition right beside them. Now I'm going to remove the masking fluid using a rubber cement pickup eraser. And as I do this, you'll start to see some of the definition that I had there will start to disappear a little bit, and it looks like I've got a lot of work. But this is by design. What I'll do is I'll come back over and I'll glaze some of these areas with the appropriate color, and it'll start to regain more of its personality and start to take shape again. But just part of the process that I use so that I can create some of these light textures in my finished painting. The next thing I'm going to do is take some cerulean blue and find some of these areas where I put the masking fluid, and I'm going to create the impression that the sky is peeking through this tree line. When you look at the tree line, there's areas where there's breaks in the tree and you can see the blue sky coming through. So this is an effective way to do this. It's fairly easy, and I do this to start so that I don't get it covered with the green that I'm going to use on a lot of this area. Next, I'm going to take a mixture of cadmium yellow with some sap green in it, and I'm going to start to glaze over a lot of these areas where I have some of the splatter. So I just take a round brush, kind of a general purpose round brush. I actually have a sable here, but just gently glaze over the areas of the splatter, and then it starts to create the brighter green leaves that you see in the areas of the tree. So now you start to get this these darker values and cooler values often that you put on around the splatter, and now you're coming back with this kind of warm bright green, and it helps put some sparkle into the trees and creates this kind of interesting texture, kind of a leafy texture. Now as I work my way around, I've got a larger brush here. I've got this jumbo round small, and here I put in some touches of a red tone. This is quinacridone coral with some quinacridone gold, and you can see it has a nice brightness to it because you're putting it on the pure white of the paper. And then I'm just going to work my way around here, and some of the areas I'll be using just a little bit of a cooler mixture. So I've got this combination of some of the bright, light, kind of yellow-green tones, and then some cooler mixtures here. And I'm just going to glaze over these areas. In the one area here where I had put down a light wash, there was quite a bit of masking in that area, so I've lost some of that. So I'm just going to glaze over that a little bit, and I'll come back over with some dark values to indicate the tree trunks that are backlit by that light kind of red tone back there. Here I've got a cool dark tone, and I'm painting some of these distant trees and giving more definition between them and the trees that are closest to us, so you can start to differentiate how deep that is in space. And it's just a cooler area back there, and some of these areas are backlit. So here I'm putting in these tree trunks, and I'll bring some of that darker value into the areas above and below where those tree trunks are at. Here I'm coming in with a darker value in different areas to give indication of some of these shadowed pockets that are in these trees. I'm going to move over to this left side. I'm going to give a little bit more information about this tree here, this taller tree, just with a little darker value. I'm going to put some of this cooler, darker tone here on the left side. A lot of this area is in shadow. I'm taking my quill brush here with this sharper point, and I'm just working in some smaller, dark valued areas, trying to set these rocks apart a little bit more from the trees that are behind them, and cleaning up some of the edges. Then I'm going to take that value and I'm going to move around my composition a little bit. So here you see me just sharpening some edges, strengthening a few values, and then on these rocks, a few of these areas here where some of the splatter was, I want to tone that down so it's not as evident. So taking kind of a neutral wash and just putting over it. So just here and there where I have some of that the white of the paper showing through in areas where I really don't want it. Here I'm still cleaning up some edges. I'm going a little darker in some areas. I just kind of again reevaluating the value on some of these, and just going a little bit darker. These rocks here are a little bit more in shadow, so not quite as lit as some of the rocks on the right side. Just a few touches of a dark value here and there. Now here I've got my rigger brush. I'm going to give the indication of saplings or some branches that are just kind of overlapping some of these green shapes that I have here. And just it's another opportunity to create some overlap and some interest. At the same time, you can use some of these branches or saplings to help create a feeling of direction too, or lead the eye into an area of the composition that you want to try and draw the viewer into. Here on the other side, I'm making some of these branch shapes here, and just starting them on the edge of some of these rocks and bringing them up. Just some sticks, some twigs, some saplings, but just interesting areas of overlap. I'm going to put a mat on this so you can get a good look at it. And there's my painting, Sparkling Waters. I hope you enjoyed this. If you want the reference material, you can find it by going to my online learning center, and at the top of that page you'll find a link to YouTube reference. If you have questions about my material, you can always go to the studio page of my website, rsurowiczart.com. And if you have questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowiczart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.